By mid-1862, America was embroiled in the Civil War. Union General James Henry Carleton met with Colonel Kit Carson in September of that year to begin a bloody relocation campaign of the Mescalero Apache in the Sierra Blanca Mountains.
And the first group of people arrived here in January of 1863, and there were groups that came thereafter.
Carleton's orders to Carson were clear in regards to the Mescalero Apache. Quote, "All Indian men of that tribe are to be killed whenever and wherever you can find them." By June of 1863, the bloody campaign expanded to the western New Mexico territories and the Navajo.
One particular letter that said that he's referring to the Navajo country, and he says, you know, the gold is just laying on the ground like the famed El Dorado. It's just laying on the ground for the taking. You know, with these riches, we can win the war.
In the fall of 1863, soldiers, volunteers, and even members of the Ute tribes began a scorched earth campaign to push the Navajo from their land.
As it turned out, that wasn't gold at all. It was copper. And that's typically what is found in, you know, the Diné homeland, whereas in Mescalero Apache country, it's more of silver.
Manifest destiny, monetary gain, and cultural conformity all fed into the internment of Native Americans at the Bosque Redondo Reservation, a land that would ultimately become a place of suffering, or Hwéeldi in the Diné language. A more than 350-mile trek through the harsh elements of the high desert became known as the Long Walk.
It began in August of 1863 was when the first group was gathered. September of 63 was when they got here. Now, it did not end until December of 1866. There were actually 53 different forced marches that brought the people here. And it varied from 50 people marching at once up to 1,000 people marching at once. The total trip, you know, of the Long Walk was about 30 days of walking. And they would run out of food, they would run out of water. There was one report from one of the soldiers who was stationed here, and his report was actually to his wife in San Francisco. He was Lieutenant George H. Pettis. He's writing home to his wife February 28, 1864, and he says, "I had to cross over 3 different mountain ranges. We had to melt snow to get water. Well, a lot of times we didn't have wood to melt our snow or keep us warm. We ran out of food, and you know, people died along the trail, and they had to be buried on the road."
When the Navajo and Apache finally arrived at Bosque Redondo, the conditions weren't much better.
This board of officers actually immediately wrote back, and they said, "This is not a good place. The water coming from the Pecos River is very alkaline, very salty. The area is prone to flooding. There's not a lot of timber, and if there was a problem, if they needed food, there's no, you know, supply depots nearby. This is not a good location." They actually suggested that the fort be built where present-day Santa Rosa is. But the general wrote back and said, well, the idea isn't to bring people closer together, it's to isolate them.
Beatings, rapes, starvation, and disease became an everyday reality for those kept prisoner at Bosque Redondo.
There were approximately 3,000 who passed away both from the walk here and during the incarceration here.
By the summer of 1865, the Mescalero Apache had enough. They hatched an escape plan that was executed on November 3rd of that year. Under the cloak of darkness, 350 people fled Bosque Redondo, leaving in scattered patterns to throw off the trailing soldiers. In the meantime, the Doolittle Committee was formed to investigate the atrocious conditions of Bosque Redondo.
They began to recognize that, number one, it was a huge toll of expense, but then the loss of life was being factored in too, because they couldn't bring enough. There was never enough food. There was never enough blankets. There was never enough supplies.
It would still take 3 years before the internment ended for the Navajo. In the spring of 1868, General William Sherman and Colonel Samuel Tappan began negotiations with Navajo leaders Manuelito and Barboncito for what would eventually become known as the Treaty of 1868.
It took a lot of convincing, but ultimately they all came to the conclusion that it was a much better idea to send the people home. And once they reached Fort Defiance, they signed their peace treaty on June 1st, 1868. And June 18th was when the procession of people returned to the homeland. Now, it was 350 miles to walk back home, but they knew where they were going. They knew that they were going home.
The dark chapter of New Mexico and American history known as Bosque Redondo forever changed the Navajo and Mescalero Apache. The entire clan system was altered. Thousands of Native Americans were placed into boarding schools, where they were forced to assimilate to Union ways of life. But on this 150th anniversary of that treaty, the suffering, the stoicism, and the resilience of a people and their culture are not forgotten.